In January 1945, silence filled the bunker, and everyone inside understood it was a sound of defeat. January 12, 1945, East Prussia. General Oberst Heinz Guderian sat in the dimly lit command bunker at Zossen, his eyes fixed on a map that had become a testament to a dying empire. Outside, the winter air was brittle, a silence so profound it felt heavy. For a brief moment, the frantic clicking of teletype machines seemed to fade. Guderian, the architect of the Blitzkrieg, reached for a lukewarm cup of coffee, his hand steady but his mind racing. He knew the stillness was a lie. Across the Vistula River, 3 million Soviet soldiers were coiled like a spring, supported by an ocean of steel and fire that the Wehrmacht could no longer match. Just days earlier, Guderian had stood before Adolf Hitler at the Adlerhorst, attempting to present the cold, mathematical reality of the Eastern Front. He had spoken of a house of cards ready to tumble. Hitler, sunken into his chair, eyes glazed with manic defiance, had dismissed the intelligence reports as the greatest bluff since Genghis Khan. He had branded Guderian's warnings as defeatism, choosing to believe in imaginary reserves and the cult of will. At 4:35 hours, the silence of the front didn't just break, it evaporated. The Soviet offensive, Operation Vistula Oder, began with a roar that could be heard 70 miles away. 10,000 guns opened fire simultaneously, a rhythmic hammering of the earth that signaled the beginning of the end. In the bunkers of the German High Command, Oakage, the reports began to trickle in, not as organized tactical updates, but as screams for help over the radio. Entire divisions were being vaporized in the first hour. The Eastern Wall, which Hitler had promised to hold for 1,000 years, was being torn open like wet paper. As the sun rose over a landscape of black smoke and blood-stained snow, the realization hit the officers at Zossen with the force of physical blow. The front had not just buckled, it had collapsed. The gateway to the heart of the Reich was now wide open. January 15, 1945, the Berlin Chancellery. As the Soviet tidal wave surged 20 miles deep into German-held territory in a single day, the atmosphere inside the Führer bunker shifted from calculated arrogance to a surreal, claustrophobic detachment. In the corridors of power, the gray men, the staff officers of the OKW, moved like ghosts. They carried folders containing the mounting casualty counts and the coordinates of lost cities, but the man at the center of the web refused to see them. General Guderian arrived back in Berlin, his face etched with the exhaustion of a man watching a slow-motion catastrophe. He found the High Command paralyzed by a leadership crisis that was as lethal as the Soviet T-34 tanks. While the frontline generals begged for permission to retreat to the more defensible lines of the Oder River, the orders coming back from Hitler's desk remained frozen in time. Hold at all costs. No foot of ground is to be surrendered. In a heated exchange that shook the walls of the map room, Guderian confronted Hitler once more. He pointed to the yawning gaps in the line where the Ninth Army was being encircled. Hitler's response was a terrifying glimpse into his unraveling psyche. He began screaming about fortress cities, towns like Breslau and Posen that would be held to the last man, even if they were completely bypassed and surrounded. To the High Command, the strategic insanity was clear. Hitler was no longer fighting a war of maneuvers. He was sacrificing entire armies to buy a few days of existence for a capital that was already doomed. The German generals, bound by their oaths and a lingering fear of the SS, watched as the map of the East turned red. By the evening of the 17th, Warsaw had fallen. The Russian steamroller, which the Nazi propaganda machine had claimed was exhausted, was moving faster than the German retreat could keep pace with. The catastrophic silence of the first day had been replaced by a cacophony of panic phone calls and the sound of secret documents being fed into furnaces. The Eastern Front was no longer a line on a map. It was a chaotic, westward rushing mass of millions, and the High Command was beginning to realize they were no longer the ones in control. January 20th, 1945. The Baltic coast. The collapse was no longer confined to military journals or secret briefings. It had spilled into the streets. As the Red Army breached the borders of East Prussia, the ancient heartland of the Prussian military elite, the German High Command faced a humanitarian disaster they had failed to plan for. Millions of German civilians, terrified by stories of Soviet retribution, began a desperate trek westward through a landscape of minus 20-degree temperatures and waist-deep snow. At the OKH headquarters, the maps now showed a terrifying reality. The Soviet 2nd and 3rd Belarusian fronts were racing toward the sea, threatening to cut off East Prussia from the rest of the Reich. Grand Admiral Karl Donitz, head of the Kriegsmarine, received word that hundreds of thousands of soldiers and refugees were trapped against the coast. The invincible German army was being squeezed into shrinking pockets, or cauldrons, where the only hope for survival lay in the icy waters of the Baltic. Inside the bunker, the air was thick with the smell of scorched paper and desperation. The high-ranking officers began to speak in whispers of Operation Hannibal, a massive naval evacuation that would eventually dwarf Dunkirk. However, Hitler's reaction to this desperate situation remained one of cold indifference. He viewed the fleeing civilians and the retreating soldiers as having failed him. To the high command, he remarked that if the German people were not strong enough to win the struggle, they deserved to perish with him. The tension between the professional officer corps and the Nazi fanatics reached a breaking point. When General Friedrich Hossbach took the initiative to break out his Fourth Army to avoid total encirclement, Hitler flew into a rage and summarily dismissed him. The message to the high command was clear. Strategic brilliance was now irrelevant. Only blind, suicidal obedience was permitted. As the Soviet tanks reached the frozen lagoons of the Frisch's Haff, crushing refugee wagons under their treads, the German high command realized they were no longer just losing a war. They were witnessing the violent erasure of their nation's Eastern history. January 31st, 1945. The Oder River. The unthinkable had happened. In just 3 weeks, the Red Army had advanced nearly 300 miles. Soviet spearheads under Marshal Zhukov now stood at the banks of the Oder River, a mere 40 miles from the suburbs of Berlin. On a clear night, the residents of the capital could hear the low, rhythmic thud of distant heavy artillery. The Stalin's organs beginning their countdown to the final assault. Inside the Zossen bunker complex, the atmosphere was no longer one of tension, but of grim, funeral-like resignation. The German high command was presiding over a ghost army. Divisions that existed on paper were, in reality, nothing more than groups of exhausted teenagers and elderly Volkssturmmen, armed with little more than single-shot Panzerfausts. Heinz Guderian, now a shelled man who had revolutionized armored warfare, looked at the situation maps and saw only a void. The Vistula-Oder offensive had effectively destroyed the Wehrmacht as a coherent fighting force in the East. In the final, desperate briefings of January, the rhetoric of the high command shifted from victory to preservation. Behind Hitler's back, senior officers began to look toward the Western Allies, nursing a delusional hope that they could surrender the remnants of the Eastern Front to the Americans or British to avoid Soviet captivity. But the reality on the ground was far more brutal. The scorched earth policy, ordered by a Führer who felt betrayed by his own people, meant that as the German army fell back, they were destroying the very infrastructure that might have sustained the fleeing millions. By the end of the month, the Eastern Front had ceased to be a front line in the traditional sense. It was a series of isolated, bloody sieges and a frantic race for the Elbe. The collapse was total, logistical, physical, and moral. The high command had spent years planning for the conquest of the East, yet they had no plan for its loss. As the first Soviet patrols crossed the frozen Oder, the men in the bunkers realized that the war wasn't just ending. The world they had built on blood and iron was being ground into the dust of history. The German high command had once spoken of a new order. Now, in the flickering light of the bunker, they spoke only of the end.